The wind came in from the high desert, carrying with it the faint tang of iron and sage, curling dust along the edges of the town square until it coated boots and hemlines in a film of grit. A sagging gallows beam cast its long shadow across the hard-packed earth, stretching like the crooked arm of some patient, unseen judge. The people gathered there seemed made of the same weather-beaten wood as the buildings behind them, stiff, sun-bleached, and unmoved by the small drama of pain that was about to play out. Somewhere in the crowd, a child coughed, quickly hushed by a mother's palm. A pair of horses snorted from where they were tied outside the mercantile, the leather tacks squeaking in the restless air. She stood at the center of it all, knees in the dirt, the coarse fibers of the rope biting her wrists. Her dress had once been blue but had faded toward the indistinct color of worn-out sky, frayed along the cuffs where her fingers had worried the seams. A loose strand of hair blew across her face, sticking to the corner of her mouth, and she turned her head just enough to shake it free. Her eyes were fixed not on the men who flanked her, nor on the gathered crowd, but on some point far beyond the buildings, an imagined horizon where no one knew her name. They called her Mara. She was 22, though the last year had pressed more weight onto her than the previous 21 combined. Her cheeks, once fuller, had hollowed with the long winter. Her hands bore the fine scratches of someone who worked without gloves, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the careful tone of one who had learned that words could too easily be used against her. Today she spoke nothing at all. The sheriff, a narrow man with a pinched mouth, stepped forward to recite the charge: theft of a loaf of bread from Harlan's bakery. The list ended there, but the way he lingered on the word bread made it sound like something larger, something with the weight of moral decay. The crowd murmured their agreement not out of cruelty, but from the conviction that the law, however small, had to be kept. Mara did not glance toward the edge of the square where a kind neighbor held her twin babies. She could not. To look at them would make her body betray her with tears. Better to keep her gaze level and her breathing slow, to endure the lash with the same stubborn silence she had used to endure the cold, the hunger, and the narrowing of her life since her husband had died. The first strike came sharp and flat, a crack that startled the younger onlookers. Pain followed a moment later, searing through the thin cotton of her dress, settling into the skin beneath. She bit the inside of her cheek, the copper taste of blood rising at once. In the spaces between the next strikes, memory slipped in uninvited. Her husband, Daniel, coming home with cold dust in his hair, the slow creep of winter into their little house, the sound of the babies breathing when they slept pressed against her chest for warmth. By the fifth blow, her breath came ragged, but still she made no sound. The murmurs grew quieter, as if the crowd were collectively shifting from righteous judgment to uneasy witness. It was then that the sound of boots cut through the stillness, measured, steady, moving across the dirt without hurry. The man who came into view wore a broad-brimmed hat pulled low against the glare. His coat was plain, his shirt the pale tan of sun-bleached canvas. He did not speak as he stepped to the edge of the circle, but the air seemed to lean toward him all the same. The sheriff finished the last of the lashes, nodded to the men holding her, and stepped back. Mara swayed where she knelt, her wrists raw beneath the rope. The man's voice came then, low but carrying easily, "How much for the bread?" It was not the kind of question the town was used to hearing after a punishment. The sheriff blinked, as though struggling to fit it into the morning's order of events. "It's paid for in flesh," he said, his tone uncertain. "Then you'll take coin," the stranger replied, drawing a small leather pouch from his coat. The coins inside clinked softly as he tossed it toward the sheriff, who caught it more out of reflex than agreement. The man's next words were measured, deliberate. "And I'll take responsibility for the woman and her children." The crowd shifted, murmurs swelling again. A few faces registered open curiosity, others held the flat disapproval reserved for things they didn't understand. Mara's heart thudded in her ears, louder than the wind. She turned her head slightly, meeting the man's gaze. His eyes were gray, steady, not searching her, not pleading with her, simply waiting. She felt the rope loosen from her wrists. The skin beneath burned, but she kept her hands still in her lap. Every instinct told her to be wary. Men did not offer help without wanting something in return, and her life since Daniel's death had taught her that debts could weigh heavier than hunger. The sheriff seemed reluctant but unwilling to refuse. "If that's how you want to spend your money, stranger," he said, slipping the coins into his pocket. The man nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then extended a hand toward Mara. He didn't move closer, didn't insist. Just held it there, the offer between them like a thin bridge over a chasm. For a long moment she didn't move. She could feel the eyes of the town on her. The butcher's wife who had once given her a bone for soup, the boy who ran errands for the blacksmith, the pastor's wife whose gaze was sharp enough to cut cloth. If she took the man's hand, she'd be stepping out of one kind of judgment into another. Her babies stirred against the neighbor's shoulder, their soft cries threading through the air. Something in her chest shifted, not a break but a small giving way, like the first thaw in spring when the ice still holds but water runs underneath. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm but not crushing, his palm warm despite the wind. He helped her to her feet without a word. They walked together toward the edge of the square, the crowd parting without being asked. The neighbor holding the twins stepped forward, relief loosening her shoulders. Mara gathered her children into her arms, the familiar weight grounding her. The man waited while she adjusted the blanket around them, then began walking toward the road that led out of town. She matched his pace, her steps unsteady at first. They didn't speak. The only sound was the wind in the eaves and the quiet shuffle of their boots on the dirt. When they reached the edge of town, she glanced back once. The crowd had already begun to disperse, folding back into their routines as if nothing unusual had happened. But Mara knew something had shifted, though she couldn't yet name it. The man slowed near where his horse was tied, a rangy bay with a saddle worn smooth at the edges. He lifted his hat briefly, running a hand through hair the color of weathered wood, then met her gaze again. "Name's Eli." She hesitated before answering. "Mara." He gave a small nod as if the exchange of names sealed something, though she wasn't sure what. He mounted the horse with easy grace, then extended a hand again, not the same kind of offer as before, but a practical one to help her into the saddle. She adjusted the twins in her arms, felt the steady rise and fall of their breathing, and allowed him to pull her up behind him. The bay started forward at a slow walk, the town receding behind them. The road ahead wound toward the low hills, their slopes cut with the pale green of early grass. Mara didn't know where he was taking her, or what the days ahead would bring. But for now, the air smelled of pine and dust, and the warmth of his back beneath her hands was something solid to hold onto. Somewhere inside, beneath the ache in her shoulders and the sting across her back, a small ember caught and held. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was enough to keep her from looking back again. The cabin stood apart from the rest of the settlement, where the road narrowed into a trail and the air shifted from dust to the resinous scent of pine. Its boards had grayed with years of weather, but the seams were tight, the roof straight, and the small porch swept clean. Eli led the horse to a hitching post beside the steps, loosening the cinch before lifting the twins into Mara's arms. He didn't linger over the transfer, didn't offer comfort or commentary, only saw that the blanket was snug before stepping back. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with a faint smell of smoke from the iron stove and something else, leather, oil, and a trace of coffee long since brewed. The single main room was simply arranged. A narrow table, 2 chairs, a low shelf holding tins and jars, a wood box by the hearth. Against the far wall stood a bed neatly made, and beside it, a cradle that looked as though it hadn't been used in years. He set down a sack of supplies near the table, then moved toward a small door at the back. "Water's through there," he said. "Pump handle stiff, lean on it." His voice was neither welcoming nor cold, simply factual, as if he were explaining the tools in a stranger's wagon. Mara set the twins in the cradle, surprised at how easily they settled after the jostle of the ride. She smoothed the blanket over them, aware of the silence that now pressed into the room. It was a different quiet from the one in the square. This one had no eyes in it, no judgment, only the soft ticking of cooling wood and the distant creak of Eli moving about. When he returned, he handed her a tin mug of water. She drank without asking where it had come from, the coolness spreading through her like a reprieve. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said. "There's work enough to keep us fed if you're willing." She nodded, unsure if he expected an answer beyond that. The notion of work enough felt like a promise she wanted to believe, though she'd learned that promises were easily broken by winter, sickness, or the slow erosion of goodwill. The days settled into a rhythm quickly. In the mornings, Eli left before sunrise to tend the horses in a low pasture beyond the trees. Mara rose shortly after, feeding the twins and heating water for coffee. He never asked her to cook, but he didn't stop her either, and soon it became an unspoken exchange. He brought back milk, flour, or dried beans from town, and she saw to meals. Their conversations were brief, limited to what the day required. Fence wires loose on the north side. Rain might come tomorrow. The twins are sleeping longer now. Yet in those small remarks, something almost like understanding began to take root. She noticed that he never raised his voice, never filled silences with idle talk. When he spoke, it was to offer something useful. The first time she went into town alone, she felt the weight of every gaze on her. The shopkeeper at the mercantile greeted her politely enough, but there was a wariness in his eyes as though she might take more than she paid for. Two women sorting bolts of calico near the counter fell silent when she passed, their conversation replaced by a sideways glance. She kept her head down, bought what she needed, and left quickly. Eli didn't ask how it had gone, but she caught him watching her more closely that evening, his gaze lingering on the tension in her shoulders. After supper, he took the coffee pot from her hands before she could scrub it, setting it aside. "I can handle that," he said. It wasn't a question. The gossip reached her in pieces, snatches of conversation at the pump, muttered warnings from a kind soul who didn't want to see her caught up in trouble. They said Eli was a man who kept to himself, who didn't go to church, who'd once walked away from a fight that everyone thought he should have won. No one seemed to know much else, and the gaps in their knowledge were quickly filled with suspicion. One afternoon, while hanging laundry behind the cabin, she saw movement at the edge of the trees. 3 men on horseback lingered there, their postures too casual to be natural. They didn't cross the fence line, but she felt the weight of their attention even from a distance. The twins slept inside, and every nerve in her body urged her to scoop them up and run, though there was nowhere to run to. She kept her hands steady as she pinned the last shirt, pretending not to notice. Eventually they turned their horses and rode away. When Eli returned that evening, he didn't comment on her stiff manner, but later, while checking the latch on the shed door, she saw the rifle leaning nearby. It hadn't been there before. Small gestures accumulated between them like stones laid without a plan, forming something solid before she realized it. On cold mornings, she found the fire already banked so she wouldn't have to light it with numb fingers. Once, when she cut her palm on a stubborn jar lid, he brought her a strip of clean cloth without asking what had happened. She began to listen for the sound of his boots returning from the pasture, a measure of the day's turning. Still, she kept a part of herself guarded. His kindness was steady, but she had seen steady things falter before. Trust, she told herself, was not given all at once. It was earned in the way a fence was mended, post by post, until it could bear weight again. The external pressure tightened when the same 3 men she'd seen near the trees appeared in town during one of her supply trips. This time they didn't keep their distance. One stepped into her path as she left the store, his grin loose with drink. "Didn't take you for the type to let a man buy you," he said, his voice pitched for others to hear. She stepped around him without replying, but the heat of humiliation crept up her neck. The second man laughed under his breath, a sound that followed her all the way to the hitching post. She mounted the borrowed mare and rode home faster than was wise on the uneven road. That night Eli asked if everything was in order. She said yes, but her voice lacked conviction, and he studied her for a long moment before nodding. Later she heard him outside, the soft metallic click of him checking the rifle's chamber. In the quiet that followed, she realized that the threat from the men was more than idle cruelty. It was a reminder that her safety here was precarious, balanced on Eli's willingness to keep watch. The thought unsettled her, not because she doubted him, but because it tied her security to something she didn't control. Over the next weeks, the air between them shifted in small, almost imperceptible ways. She found herself asking about his work with the horses, how he knew when one was ready to break or when it needed more time. His answers were slow, thoughtful, as if he weighed each word. "You can't rush trust," he told her once, running a hand down the neck of a young gelding. She thought of fences again and the slow work of mending. The twins began to smile more often, their cheeks filling out. Sometimes Eli would crouch beside the cradle, not touching them, just watching until they cooed at the sight of him. Those were the moments that pressed against the walls she'd built inside herself, testing their strength. One evening, after a long day of mending fence in the lower field, they sat on the porch with coffee. The air was cool, the light fading to that deep blue that comes before night. Somewhere in the trees, a bird called once, then fell silent. "You'll need to go into town again soon," he said. She nodded, bracing herself for the stares, the whispers. But then he added, "I'll ride in with you this time." His tone carried no suggestion of ownership, only of shared burden. It was a small thing, yet it landed with surprising weight. She realized she had begun to think of "we" without meaning to. The next day passed without incident, but the sense of something building remained, like the heaviness in the air before a storm. When she looked toward the horizon that evening, the sky was streaked with clouds, their edges darkening. Eli stood at the fence line, watching the same sky, his posture loose but his attention fixed. She didn't ask what he was thinking. Some things she had learned revealed themselves in their own time. For now, she only knew that the cabin no longer felt like a place she was passing through. It had begun to feel like a place she might stay, though the question of whether she could keep it, whether the world outside would let her, remained unanswered. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. She gathered the twins from where they played on a blanket inside, closing the door against the cool draft. Eli came in a few minutes later, shaking off his coat, his hair damp at the temples. He glanced at her, then at the babies, and something unspoken passed between them. Not a promise, not yet, but a recognition of shared ground. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming on the roof. Mara stood by the window watching the world blur. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the old fear stir, but alongside it was something steadier, something that made her breathe a little deeper. The storm would pass. What came after, she wasn't certain. But for the first time in a long while, she wanted to find out. The morning began with a restless quiet, the kind that pressed against the walls before a shift in weather or fortune. Mist clung low in the pines, threading itself through the narrow path to the pasture. Eli saddled the bay without speaking, his movements slower than usual, deliberate in a way that made Mara notice. She busied herself with feeding the twins, but her eyes kept drifting toward the open door where the cool air spilled in. When he was ready to ride out, he paused at the threshold. "Fence line in the south field's loose," he said. "Might be back late." His tone carried nothing unusual, yet something in the way he adjusted his hat brim, in the half-beat he lingered before stepping outside, lodged itself in her mind. The day stretched long without him. She hung laundry, swept the floor, shelled the last of the dry beans into a bowl. Now and then she went to the window, scanning the edge of the trees as if she might catch sight of him sooner than expected. The twins were restless, their cries sharper, as though they too sensed a disturbance. It was near mid-afternoon when she heard hoofbeats, more than one set, approaching not from the pasture trail but from the main road. Her pulse quickened. 3 men rode into view, their shapes solidifying from the haze of distance. She recognized them at once. The same ranch hands who had lingered at the tree line weeks ago, the same who had spoken in town with sneering familiarity. They dismounted without haste, dust rising around their boots. The lead man, broad-shouldered and loose at the joints, let his gaze drift over the cabin before settling on her through the open doorway. "Afternoon," he called, voice carrying the false ease of someone who'd already decided how things would go. Mara stepped outside, the door closing behind her with a muted thud. "Eli's not here." She kept her voice level, her hands still at her sides. "That's plain enough," he said, taking a step closer. The others fanned out slightly, their eyes tracking her with a lazy sort of watchfulness that made her skin prickle. "We've been hearing about you. Figure a woman ought to know who's talking." "I'm not interested in talk." He chuckled, glancing over his shoulder at the others, as if to confirm that she'd played her part in the scene they'd imagined. "Word is you were bought out of trouble. Bread and all." "That true?" Mara felt the heat rise in her chest, not from shame but from the deliberate cruelty behind his smile. "You should leave." "Maybe," he said, tilting his head as if weighing the notion. "But maybe we're curious about what a man gets when he pays for a woman." The words landed like a blow, but she stood her ground. Behind her, the twins began to cry, their voices thin but insistent through the wood of the door. The sound steadied her. "You'll turn around," she said, each word measured, "and you'll go back to wherever it is you came from." The smile thinned. "And if we don't?" She took a step forward, closing the space between them by a fraction. "Then you'll wish you had." Her voice did not rise, but something in it, born of hunger, of cold nights, of every lash in the square, made the moment stretch taut. For a heartbeat, none of them moved. Then, from the road, another set of hoofbeats cut into the stillness. Eli's figure emerged, the bay's dark coat gleaming with sweat. He didn't look at her first, his eyes fixed on the 3 men, reading the arrangement in a glance. He reined in a few yards from the porch, his posture loose but his presence carrying the weight of a drawn bow. "Afternoon," he said, the single word flat enough to strip away any pretense of courtesy. The leader turned slightly, adopting a casual stance that didn't reach his shoulders. "We were just visiting." Eli's gaze shifted to Mara, as if asking without words whether she wanted him to take this from her. She didn't look away. "They were leaving," she said. Something flickered in his expression, approval maybe or trust, and he nodded once. "Then best get to it." The men lingered a moment longer, but whatever they saw in the combined weight of her stance and his quiet certainty was enough to send them toward their horses. The leader mounted last, his smirk gone, replaced by something harder to name. Without another word they turned and rode off, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the trees. When the dust settled, Eli dismounted and tied the bay to the post. He didn't ask what had been said, and she didn't offer it. Instead, they stood there for a while, the air between them carrying more than it had the day before. Inside, the twins' cries had softened to murmurs. She went to them, lifting each into her arms in turn. Eli stayed near the doorway, as though giving her space but remaining close enough to be called upon. "You didn't have to," she began, but he shook his head before she could finish. "You spoke for yourself," he said simply. "That matters." Something in her eased at that, not because he'd approved but because he'd recognized it. The choice to stand her ground had been hers alone, and he had let it be so. The rest of the day moved in the ordinary way, water drawn from the pump, wood stacked by the stove, supper simmering in a dented pot. Yet the cabin felt altered, as if the walls themselves had heard and decided to keep the memory. After the twins were asleep, they sat on the porch, the lantern between them casting a low circle of light. The air was cooler now, the earlier mist burned off to reveal a sky scattered with stars. "You could go," Eli said after a long silence. His voice was even, without persuasion or warning. "Take the twins somewhere far. Start again." She considered the thought, tracing it to its edges. There was truth in it. Leaving would free her from the shadow of the town's gossip, from the men who thought they could measure her worth in coin. Yet it would also mean walking away from what had been built here in the quiet. The mornings with coffee on the stove, the sound of his boots returning, the small ways he'd made space for her without pressing into it. "I don't want to go," she said finally. He looked at her, then really looked, as if weighing the steadiness in her voice. Whatever he found there, it was enough. In the days that followed, word must have spread about the standoff, because no one came near the cabin without reason. In town, the stares remained, but something in her own bearing had shifted. She met eyes now instead of avoiding them. The shopkeeper spoke to her without the careful politeness he'd used before. The pastor's wife nodded in passing, which might have been approval or simple acknowledgement, but it felt like a crack in the wall that had stood between her and the rest of the town. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the air turned sharp, she found Eli repairing a section of the fence that had warped under summer storms. She joined him without being asked, holding posts steady while he hammered them in place. They worked without much talk, the rhythm of their labor steady as a heartbeat. At one point he passed her a rail, their fingers brushing. Neither pulled away. It was not a deliberate touch, not the beginning of anything in the way the town might imagine, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. When the last post was set, they leaned against the fence, looking out over the darkening field. A single lantern glowed in the cabin window, marking the place they'd returned to. "I'll keep watch," he said quietly, not as a vow but as a fact. "I know," she replied and realized it was the truth. They walked back together, the night gathering around them. Inside, the twins stirred in their cradle, then settled again. She stood for a moment by the window, watching the stars sharpen in the clear sky, their light steady against the vast dark. For the first time in months, she did not feel like someone living at the mercy of the next turn in fortune. The choice she'd made, to stay, to claim the life that was taking shape here, sat in her chest like something solid and warm. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of earth and the faint promise of rain. She let the sound fill the quiet between her and Eli, knowing that not all things needed to be spoken to be understood. The night held and she with it.